You get a couple of synchronicities. It's got this playful, glimmering quality, a glimpse, a sort of, magical shiver. Pretty awesome. It feels like there's like another layer of meaning to life. But if you have those things happening hourly, no way, man, you're in the zone. You're on the far end of that pathological spectrum, and whether or not you deserve to be called crazy or not, I'm not going to say, but it's part of the picture, and I think we're only now kind of realizing how challenging it is to deal with.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. My guest today is one of my favorite living writers, Erik Davis. Erik kind of stands tall at the intersection between mysticism, technology, and counterculture. He's the author of many great books, among them TechGnosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, as well as High Weirdness, a book that explores 1970s counterculture and its relationship with altered states of consciousness. Erik is also an Esalen faculty member, having recently taught about embodied writing and spiritual practice. In this conversation, we went into his new book, Blotter, an extended meditation on LSD blotter art and the culture that surrounds it. We also found time to veer off into a host of topics, including Terence McKenna, John C. Lilly, Dick Price, Madness, Stan Grof, the Spiritual Emergency Network, Prep School Deadheads, the Village Voice newspaper, the Internet and how it kills subcultures, the phenomenon of what Erik calls cannabis thinking, tape machines, the pranksters, Phillip K. poster art, the DEA, and a lot more. This is Erik Davis.
I thought it might be kind of fun to just start off this discussion speaking a little bit about writing. And I was curious, who were some of your favorite writers when you were a teenager and when you're thinking to yourself, like, I want to do this?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I don't, it's funny. I don't know when I started thinking, I want to be a writer. It was more that I was always a reader. And when, in high school, when I started writing papers for English class, I got into it. Like I enjoyed always that kind of mode of like critical writing, but like really having fun with the language and, being kind of sassy with it. And so I definitely one of my earliest influences was Hunter S. Thompson. I think I started reading Thompson when I was 12 or 13, when I was just getting into like smoking weed and being a little Southern California stoner kid.
Where were you in Southern California?
I grew up in north of San Diego, near Del Mar.
Okay.
I was in Del Mar, and then I moved, just inland a little bit.
So what was your first Hunter Thompson book?
I think I read The Great Shark Hunt first, and I was into the kind of journalism picture of it, but I also read Fear and Loathing around the same time. Yeah, so I just remember I have a journal, journal that I kept when I went to England when I was 13 years old. And it was like just the summer before high school. So I was already reading it then. And I read it now and it's hilarious because it's me trying to like do Hunter S. Thompson and like write about like traveling with my mom in England and like bed and breakfasts and, going to Stonehenge and stuff. And I'm writing in this kind of over the top sort of gonzo way. Yeah. And so that was a really, really important kind of early influence in high school.
Is Great Shark Hunt collection from the 80s or 70s?
I don't remember. I think it came out in the early 80s, but it's of the journalism mostly from the 70s. Mm-hmm. So it's got the great piece on like the Super Bowl and, like a lot of the stuff that he did for Rolling Stone. Mm-hmm. So that really planted a seed. And in some ways I kind of, even though I don't really do that kind of journalism anymore, and I haven't really for a while, but I still kind of think of myself in that sort of current of like cultural criticism, cultural journalism,
participatory,
new journalism to a degree. But I usually, even when I was writing most of my kind of cultural journalism, like in the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s for Village Voice most centrally, but other places as well, is that I would go and I would do kind of participant observer things, but I didn't usually write about myself in quite the same way. But it was the same spirit where I was like, I would immerse myself in the subculture and then kind of like take a step back. And so when I described it, it still had a little bit of that journalistic distance, but I had sort of dipped myself into the current. And so I like to think at least that it had more of an insider's vibe. And it was always really important for me when I wrote about subcultures, and still when I write about that stuff, that even if I'm sometimes critical or sometimes make fun of aspects of it, that anybody in the scene who's open-minded could read what I've written and gone, yeah, he got it. He understands what that's about. And that was always really important for me to like grok the subculture that I'm interested in, even if it isn't mine, but enough to be able to, with its language, its attitude, its kind of worldview, to get it right. You know, even if it wasn't exactly mine. And so I that kind of participatory experience has always been really important to my work.
So you're at Yale from the kind of mid to late 80s, is that right?
Yeah.
Was there counterculture in New Haven or at Yale at that time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. You know, I came in as, you know, I went to public high school, Torrey Pines High School in Del Mar. It's like where Tony Hawk went to high school. And it was very much a California public high school. Is kind of like, if anybody's seen Fast Times at Ridgemont High, it was like Ridgemont High surrounded by chaparral.
Were you going to dead shows and such?
Yeah, we started going to dead shows in high school, towards the end of high school. And, you know, there was a lot of like weird counterculture still around the area. So we'd go to like the Hare Krishna temple, or we'd go to the Muktananda temple. We'd smoke weed and go in and like chant Hare Krishna for 3 hours and get totally high. And, you know, like there was sort of a weird stoner alternative spirituality current that was very much part of North County. You know, this self-realization fellowship was there. And, you know, when I grew up, it was like, you know, people grow up and there might be like the church that their local church that they always kind of remember or whatever. But like the sacred site that was most visible in my world was the self-realization.
What is self-realization? I've heard that a lot.
Oh, sure. It's the organization founded by Paramahansa Yogananda. And Yogananda wrote the autobiography of a yogi, which was like a classic text in the 60s and 70s. I mean, he wrote it earlier, but it was like one of those like texts like Carlos Castaneda or whatever that everybody read. Yeah. And he was an Indian yogi who came to Los Angeles and started his kind of empire. And he was in some ways the first rock star yogi. Cool guy, did interesting stuff. You know, there's always a little things around groups like that.
Scandalous?
But it wasn't like a monster scandal.
Okay.
Anyway, so he has a number of interesting places throughout the Southern California that are really worth visiting. There's a beautiful place in Pacific Palisades called Lake Shrine, where you can go and there's a lake and they have all these interesting architectural elements. This is stuff I wrote about in my book, The Visionary State. But the Self-Realization Fellowship, it's right on the Coast Highway, and it's got a nice little meditation garden, got an onion dome, the whole thing. So it's like, that's really kind of part of my sense of like what the home psychogeography involves, these weird religious currents. And that was very much part of my growing up as well.
So when you arrive to Yale and during your time there, was there a way to access sort of a counterculture? Did that exist within the confines of the university?
Yeah, that was interesting. So I showed up and I was really like fish out of water. Like I didn't know how radical it was going to be. I was always going to go to Berkeley, and I had really good grades. So if you have good grades and you could go to an Ivy League, Berkeley like rolled out the red carpet. They like give you guaranteed housing and like stack access and all this stuff that you wouldn't get as a normal undergraduate. And I was always going to go there. And I just applied to other schools just on a whim. Like, why not? You know, Oberlin, Brown, whatever. Yale, okay. Didn't really expect to get in. And I got into every place and I was like, okay. And it was really, in some ways, one of the most significant decisions in my life that really felt like, in retrospect, like a decision. Like sometimes we make big decisions and later on we go, I wasn't making any decision. I was just being pushed by forces, and that was inevitable. And it might have looked like a decision at the time. But this one was kind of on an interesting knife edge. And boy, would my life have been different if I had stayed in California. Nobody was putting pressure on me. It wasn't like my folks were like, oh, you got to go to Yale. That's really, you know, they didn't care. And it was just because it was more weird. Like I wouldn't know, it was more different. It was like a change up. Yeah. And it really was different. And to get to your question, it was quite challenging because I was used to a certain kind of sort of lackadaisical, permissive, druggy culture, and it really wasn't like that. And I started to hang out with people who, for the most part, there were a couple of individuals who were already, they liked the Dead, or had taken psychedelics a lot in high school, but they were individuals. They weren't like, it wasn't like a scene. And I think it was end of freshman year, maybe it was sophomore year, I don't remember, is that I discovered that there was like a crew of psychedelic deadheads on the campus. And so I met them and like hung out with them a couple times. But they were this other kind of deadhead. They were like prep school deadheads.
Yeah.
So they had developed their whole psychedelic culture inside the confines, the insular confines of a prep school, which I found 100% alienating. I could not deal with it. It was just too insular. It was like my sense of growing up as like a psychedelic person when I was young, as a high school, just goofing around, was like psychedelics was part of this big sloppy world where you're like stumbling through the suburbs to get to some surfer kegger party where some guy might be there who had some hash that you did that. It was a very open kind of experience of like this kind of permissive Southern California zone. The insularity of their world was just I just couldn't really hang with it. So I ended up just having friends who had a psychedelic side to them. Yeah, it's funny actually. One guy I was thinking of, I haven't thought about him for a while, was this guy named John Brewer. I lived with him one summer in New Haven, and we were friends throughout the time I was there. He was really interesting. He had like super long hair. He smoked weed. He was a libertarian. He was like a conservative libertarian, but he loved the Stooges. He loved like rock and roll, and he was like a really funny kind of head. He loved Robert Anton Wilson. We talked about Robert Anton Wilson a lot and stuff like that. And he had this great story that who knows, it's apocryphal, but it has a ring of truth to it. That in the late 70s, there was one of the colleges on campus, because Yale's divided into colleges, had a big psychedelic scene there, and they were all doing lots of acid, and they loved Robert Anton Wilson and all that kind of stuff, and Illuminatus and all that kind of thing. And then at the end of the 4 years, like most of them went and worked for the CIA.
Wow. Crazy.
And so it's like, always reminds me, I love that story, not just because it's a fun, weird story, but because there's something we forget. We know the CIA and the intelligence world has been aware of psychedelics since the early 1950s. And, of course, there's the horrors of MK Ultra. And there's also an internal psychedelic culture inside of the intelligence services that I don't think we really know what it's like. I mean, we do know, for example, that they would dose each other unknowingly. So they would do it to test like their own people, and you'd go to a party and you had a drink, and then, oh, fuck, like they did it to me again or whatever. So there's already, and that's all in the 50s. And you're like, oh, what? Do you think it stops? You think something so powerful, even if it's weird and mystical and otherworldly, do you think they're going to like ignore that? No, they're not. So there's some weird internal culture that is like, has this sort of psychedelic dimension that we don't really
we never
tap into if we're not in that zone. So
did you adjust to being on the East Coast? I mean, if you started writing for The Voice, I'm assuming you moved to New York after?
Yeah, I moved to New York right after. Yeah, I did adjust. I like the energy. I like the mental energy of it. I liked writing. In college, I started to write for a music magazine, and that was the next kind of phase of the Hunter S. Thompson story, because I was writing all these papers for English class, philosophy class, literary theory, and I really liked it. I mean, I liked doing intellectual work and being challenged that way, and I was always drawn to the weird. I was drawn to like Gnosticism or simulation theory or postmodernism, because it was so like kind of science fictional or whatever. I wasn't super political in my approach, even though it was a lot of lefty kind of sensibility around there, which was fine. It was like part of my world, but I really gravitated towards this kind of science fiction, speculative, post-human stuff. But then there was this music magazine called Nadine, and I was like, oh, I'll write for that. And then that was where all my like Hunter S. Thompson id could go, into these sort of writing these rock pieces. And I wrote a piece about Nick Cave, and then like the guys who published it were like, have you heard of Lester Bangs, who was this classic,
Had you have?
And at the time I hadn't, so I was already kind of writing in that style. And then I discovered Lester Bangs, and he was kind of like Hunter S. Thompson at a later period for me, of like inviting a certain over-the-top way of writing, which isn't the way I really write now, but it was for a while the way my music writing was, and some of my culture criticism had this kind of intense, over the top, sort of almost parodic, self-parodic kind of excess that then got sort of refined over the years, but always gave me a sense of that writing, even nonfiction writing, even essay writing, even journalism should be intense, entertaining, and a little weird. Like that's like, it's got to have those elements in it. And so even my academic writing generally has at least some of that in it, because I feel like I'm ultimately of that kind of current.
I want to hear a little bit about like writing about in the 90s, writing about the subcultures that you dipped into, because it seems like you were really active as a feature writer and journalist at that time.
I mean, it was an interesting time for subculture. In some ways, I would say it was kind of the last great age for subcultures. I have a personal opinion that is debatable, but I kind of think that once the internet kind of dominates the way that people organize themselves culturally, you kind of lose subculture. That subculture requires a non-internet physical spatial logic where you have to go to certain places and you don't know who's there, and you have to meet someone and get kind of initiated or find a way in, and then and then maybe it's scary or weird, and if you just do it all on the internet, it's something else. I mean, there are pockets, obviously there's like subcultural like forms, tribes, whatever you want to call them, that are on the internet too, like people who are obsessed about a certain era of anime culture or whatever, a million things, everything.
Sure.
There's one of those pockets online, but that's not to me what a subculture is. Subculture requires some kind of physical investment, and it requires how are you going to dress, how are you going to wear your hair, how are you going to talk, how are you going to interact, and there's some kind of process of entering it that requires some kind of work or luck or risk or something like that.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in subcultures, and I wrote a lot about them, from like, Star Trek fandom, or like people who were into like dressing up like Klingons, to like UFO stuff and neo-pagans and, psychedelic weirdos and
Go a Gill
and rainbow gatherings. And so it was a really fun beat. And it was funny at the Village Voice. So the Village Voice is a paper, goes back to the, I should know this, like late 40s, I think, associated with very much with the Village being Greenwich Village, and like the politics in lefty Bohemia in New York City, and then and it was well named because one of the things that was important about the Village Voice, at least in those years, was the voice, that they would have writers who had individual voices. And so the editors were editing them not just to make a good piece of copy, but to kind of bring out a singular voice out of the writers who had that potential. And so it was a great place for me, because even though it was sort of identity politics like 1.0, where there were a lot of people were like, it was a lot, there's like African-American voices and lesbian voices and gay voices. And it was like very, that kind of identity way of doing politics was already emerging. Like my identity was kind of just weird shit. So like I could do psychedelics, I could do UFOs, I could do paganism or a high theory, weird Deleuze postmodern theory as like the mode of, that was kind of my identity. So it was a really interesting place, and I'll always be very, in a way, I was the happiest I've ever been as a writer, was writing those things, because it was really fun. And you're writing in it's still an analog world, so you're writing for a newspaper that then goes out, and it's published on a day, and then it comes out and sit there for a week, and then it's gone. And for that week, people are reading your stuff, and then it's fish wrap. But it's part of the life of the city, as opposed to like writing for online. Like I've never enjoyed just writing online. Like I do it. I have a Substack. It's a lot of fun.
Great Substack, Burning Shore.
Yeah,
it's awesome. I love it.
Yeah, no, and it's good. And I've actually been happy. Before the Substack came out, I really was very not happy writing online, and I tended not to do it. But once there was a kind of easy way to have a newsletter that comes in your email box, that has a kind of some sort of subscription model that I mostly ignore.
Kindly.
I'm like, well, yeah, I'm not going to be one of these like squeeze you for a dime. That's just not my style. But
this dimes add up, apparently, according to some people.
No, it's not nothing, anyway, that's allowed me to feel kind of, because there's a kind of intimacy to that, and it reminds me some of more like early bulletin boards, which were also fun, or early listservs, which I really enjoyed in the 90s, early 2000s. But I always really liked print. I pretty much, I feel like I'm a kind of ultimately still a creature of print. And when I put books out, they got to be pretty. They got to look good, and they tend to like I've been able to have some control over how they look, even working with publishers, and I've just been really lucky that way. And I'm happy to say that they generally look pretty good.
Well, I just had the experience of rereading High Weirdness, and I have no idea what it looks like because I listened to it. Oh, right. So you were in my head, for 18 hours or so.
Yeah.
And I want to take advantage of the fact that you're here because I speak about Terence McKenna at Esalen a lot, and I think that I generally start my discussion about McKenna by saying, I don't really understand what this guy is saying, but I know that it's fascinating. I know that it's important, and there's something here to grasp. Talk to me a little bit. So High Weirdness, it has these three characters, especially, that you go into: Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna, and Phillip K. Dick. And I'd love to just get a little bit of your take on McKenna and why you think he's such a valuable character when it comes to wisdom and psychedelic wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about Terence forever. Terence is why I first came to Esalen, because Terence would come here once a year for many, many years. He'd be in the little house, hunkered down, and he would just talk, but a lot. He could just keep talking. Oh, yeah. Cannabis was copious, and invited me down here. Is he
the only person in the world who can speak better?
Yeah.
High. That's not a normal thing.
Yeah. No, it's he and pretty regularly. I mean, that's the funny thing about Terence, or one of many funny things about Terence, is that while people associate him with psychedelics, with mushrooms, and with DMT in particular, and those associations are totally justified. I mean, the guy wrote, literally with his brother, wrote the book on growing psilocybin mushrooms, and in that one act kind of changed head culture, and was definitely the first place that most people heard about DMT, at least in the 1990s. Because of him, more people knew about DMT than smoked DMT. I remember running at a rave, this was 94 or something like that, and this kid just had a DMT t-shirt, and I went up to him as if he was a fellow initiate, and went, yeah, you've done that stuff? And he goes, no, I've heard about it from Terence. And so it was like a mythical drug that had meaning, even if you hadn't taken it, because of the way he talked about it. But despite his connections with DMT, and despite his connections with psilocybin, I think of Terence principally as a cannabis guy.
Interesting.
He was deeply cannabis. And I say that not just because he enjoyed strong cannabis and used it a lot, and it was just always part of his life. Before he became well known, he was doing little what he called raps.
Yeah.
Back in the 60s, he'd have people come over to his house. He had all these weird books. He'd sit down on a rug on the floor. He'd start rolling joints. He'd sit on the carpet. People would hang out, and he'd just start talking. But it's more that there's a certain kind of thinking on cannabis that is very much reflected in the way he puts ideas together.
Yeah.
It's a kind of associational thinking. And most of us, we lose memory capacity when we're stoned. So while we can do those connections and those weird leaps of logic and sort of speculative thinking, and this reminds me of that, and that kind of stuff, we don't have the archive to draw on, because we've kind of lost the names of, it's that guy, who wrote that book. That doesn't work. You need to be able to go Francis Yates, the book on Giordano Bruno, or whatever it is. You need you need to be able to pull all the material, and he just had that kind of mind where he could just play with it, and so it's really the best form of cannabis thinking.
Were you a cannabis thinker when you were? Were you a cannabis writer in the 90s at all?
No, it's funny. I've always sort of, not always, but mostly kept those two just in parallel. where I would often think of ideas, sketch out ideas, particularly of the more speculative stuff that I would do in a cannabis mode, but I would very rarely, basically never write like the first draft. Sometimes I would rewrite, edit and rewrite. Sometimes would be really nice. It would also often open up like other kind of possibilities. And occasionally I've given talks high, and when it works, it's great, but it's a little more of like a dice roll for me, because if I get off or I lose the thread, it's like not fun at all. I kind of prefer the challenge of simulating druggy thinking in my writing.
A bit like Tom Wolfe.
Straight.
Tom Wolfe never took LSD, but he was ironically one of the people who could translate the LSD experience.
Yeah.
And I think.
Yeah.
In creating an analog there.
Yeah.
But with Terence, did you interview him?
Yeah. So I met Terence in the early 90s, kind of as like a colleague. He was friends of friends. So I met him as sort of like a fellow grunt in the culture wars, which is how he referred to me once in an inscription in a book that he wrote. So I did interview him a couple times in the early to mid 90s when he had his sort of first mainstream kind of wave of writing about him. There was a big Esquire profile, and then there was some other magazines that I didn't do the Esquire profile, but other things after that. So I did meet him in the context of being a journalist, but we also hit it off right. We're like some very similar kind of people, interested in esotericism and funny, and a little kind of a dark sense of humor and stuff like that. So we were kind of colleague friends over the years, and then towards the end of his life, we got to know each other a little bit better. Partly, I went to Hawaii and interviewed him when he was sick. So I did what I have referred to as the last interview. Although some people say there was one or two other ones that were recorded, but whatever. That's how it's known online, and it's all on YouTube. And it was pretty interesting. I mean, his powers were fading a bit, but more just in terms of his energy rather than what he was saying. So that was another like significant interview I did with him. And he also was around my house a lot at that time because we were near UCSF where he was getting his treatment. So in a lot of ways, I got to spend more time with him in the last year of his life. So I was connected with him. I think he's, it's funny about how is he going to be seen in the future. I really don't know, Sam. And I don't know even what should be the case. Like, I'm not going to stand here and go, oh no, he's the most significant, da-da-da-da-da. For me, he's just at the bottom, just endlessly entertaining.
Yes.
And I rate entertainment very, very highly. I mean, people don't like that word. It sounds a little like lowbrow or something like that. And I'm not like that. Like, we just got out of this writing workshop this week here at Esalen, which was really great. And you go around at the end and everybody says things and they're, oh, thank you. I really love this. And it was so interesting. And how do you bring meditation in terms of writing, and this inspired this. And it was like, oh, great. Positive feedback. I can take it. And, it's fun. And then somebody said, and you guys were really entertaining. And I went, ding, score.
Yeah.
I just, even as a writer, like, I don't really.
Yes.
You think it's cool. Your idea is great. But like, if you were entertained, I've done my job.
Yes, indeed. I can see that in your writing, like on a sentence level.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's not a lot of room for the boring.
Yeah. No, and it's a really high value for me. And so when I say that at the end of the day, Terence was deeply, deeply entertaining, it's not as superficial as that might sound. It's that he actually was able to like think and talk and play with language and play with ideas in a way that was just extraordinarily engaging and delicious. Kind of like having a trip. Like, you go on a trip, weird ideas, synchronicities, symbols come into play, things seem really significant. And then the next day you might look back and go, what was that? Like, did I really have any insights there? And maybe you did, and maybe you didn't. But you had a great time, and in a good way, in a rich way, in a life-affirming way, the way going out to nature and being inspired by the trees and the birds. But with Terence, you're not going out into nature, you're going into the realm of ideas, and you're being inspired by the elves of language and the gnomes of arcane esoteric lore and the fairies of funny speech. So it's sort of an enchanted way of thinking, and the ideas themselves are kind of enchanted in both a good and a bad way. I mean, meaning that they're enchanted like, ooh, maybe we are being sucked towards the end of history, and that, you know, we're in the last phases and everything is da 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 da, or not. But that's sort of an attractive, you know, kind of idea that he would play with.
Yeah, that's great. He is probably the thinker that is best represented in the current Esalen archive in terms of the number of audio and video tapes there. I can only assume that when he came here, he was very firm on the fact that he would be taped.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're all, we maybe have 100 hours of Terence. And it represents this like wonderful vault of wisdom.
Well, it's such a great arc too, because it begins when he's still very, very unknown. I mean, not very unknown, but he was known in certain circles. He was already on the radio. I believe I don't know what the first date when he was here, but I think it's like mid 80s.
Yeah, something like that.
85, something like that, because I know there's already that conference out of which Maps emerges around that time. I think it's 85. Maybe, you know, a couple years off. And then I think he first started getting picked up in LA, was on the radio, or he had a column. Luckily, many of these details will be filled out by the forthcoming biography of Terence McKenna, which is coming out from MIT Press by my friend Graham St. John. And he's done an exhaustive work. I mean, it's going to be big fatty, you know, of Terence lore. So those of you who have been hungry for the deets, you know, hold off for a little bit longer and you're going to get your fill.
And anybody who hasn't read the 2012 book by Dennis McKenna, Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, read that as well.
Yeah, it's super fascinating.
He was well supported. So whoever was programming Esalen at that time, I think it might be Nancy Lunny, someone strongly believed in Terence McKenna. And I wanted to play this little clip from High Weirdness because I'm thinking about the fact that he's so well represented in the archive, and the way that I'm experiencing him is through tapes. And there's this piece of High Weirdness when you're speaking about tape machines as more than tools, as allegories. I want to play it for you and see if you have thoughts about it.
Wilson's self-hypnosis here was also another example of freaks messing around with tape machines. The McKennas brought one to the jungle, the Merry Pranksters used them in the acid tests, psychedelic music was made from them, and Leary recommended committing the prayers and prompts of the psychedelic experience to tape. But tape machines were more than tools in the countercultural era. They were also media allegories, the technological instantiation of models of cognition characterized by reality programming, feedback loops, and the repeating tapes of the mind. Tape machines mediated consciousness both literally and figuratively, reframing thought, language, sound, and experience as a kind of material amenable to inscription, repetition, splices, and overdubs. Tape recorders were icons of meta-programming.
Thoughts? Yeah, what is that? Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that, you know, in the context of Esalen, because one of the real inspirations of that insight or that approach to thinking about tape, which was, you know, quite significant. It really had a lot of influences across the board, from avant-garde music to the kind of crazy experimentation of the Merry Pranksters,
yes,
you know, to a lot of, you know, just the whole development of the multi-track studio, and with the way the multi-track studio becomes like a place to construct kind of virtual worlds. You know, you don't get Dark Side of the Moon without a multi-track studio, and you can't make a Dark Side of the Moon in the 1950s. You know, you need that kind of the way that tape can be brought together and overdubbed and et cetera, to be able to create that kind of space. But one of the main inspirations there were the experiments that John Lilly was doing with repeated tape.
Really?
Tell me. And they definitely happened here, or they happened other places, but they definitely happened at Esalen as well. And he would loop a term, and then you would listen to it, and you would the whole invitation was to watch the conventional meaning break down, and for other words and other things you start to hallucinate, as audio hallucination. And the most famous word was cogitate.
Uh-huh.
So you'd go in, you'd be in a session, and it would be, they put on the tape loop, and it would be like cogitate, 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 cogitate. And after a while, it's no longer a word, it becomes phonemes. Then you start hearing other words and what words you're hearing. So that's what I mean, where it's like the tape becomes a way of approaching consciousness and, experience ultimately as something that can be, as an inscription or something that can be messed with the way you can mess with a tape loop. And and this is a common thing with media technology, is we get the media technologies and then we use them as allegories for how consciousness works. So we now it's computing. I don't have the bandwidth for that. I need more memory. I don't, we start to think of ourselves as computing machines,
right.
And not just like in an informal way, but that's how the cognitive scientists are thinking. But in back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, one of the big words was programming.
Yeah.
The idea that we are programmed. And this is a time when people are becoming very aware of propaganda, of the social construction of reality. How do we get these ideas in our heads? So people were becoming more and more aware that, well, in some ways, what civilization does to us is program us from little kids up, and that part of the goal of a lot of consciousness work in the 60s and 70s, and part of the goal of Esalen in those days was to kind of undermine your programming and create space for something else to happen. That something else gets complicated because, to put it more realistically, you would say you can deprogram, but you're kind of just opening a space for a new program. So where does the new program come from? It's not like you can, maybe actually even one idea of what's true awakening is you're actually able to respond to the world without running on programs or scripts is another way of thinking about it. But most of us don't live in that world. We might be able to nudge our programming a little bit, but it's usually by getting a new program. It's like the way cognitive behavior therapy works. You have these negative tape loops in your head, oh, I suck, oh, I suck, oh, I suck. Well, why don't you replace it with something like, oh, actually, I can do this. Yeah. Oh, actually, I can do this. Right. Oh, actually, I can do this. So, in a way, you're kind of taking a programming model of cognition and then tweaking it, reprogramming it. So that whole notion of programming and reprogramming and deconstructing programming is a really important thing to grok, to try to understand not just what people were doing in the 60s and 70s at places like Esalen or with psychedelic therapy and things like that, but really just to try to kind of get closer to the texture of how weird it is to be conscious and trying to think well and trying to be a good person in such a hyper-technological environment where we're just surrounded. It's not just that we're surrounded by media. We are made of media, not exclusively, but in large ways we're sort of made or effects of mediation. The books we've read, the technologies we've plugged into, the inevitable allegories that come from these technologies that we're sort of looped into whether we want to be or not. And so we're kind of inside of this thing trying to get out or get some space to change, to have connect with people in different ways, to overcome our negative programming. So it's a really important, kind of idea. And that was what people, when people would get into alternative religious movements in the 70s, and some of these were really extreme movements. It's what we call cults. It's a weird word, cult. We all kind of know what it means, but some religious scholars refuse to use it because it's always the outside people who are saying what a cult is, and early Christianity looks like a cult, and things like that. So there is something problematic about the word, but on the other hand, we all kind of got a sense of the glassy-eyed repetition of phrases. You're not connected to the outside world. There's a totalitarian leader, and you're doing everything they say, and there's usually some kind of weird sexual dynamics, and you kind of your brain changes. Your personality might change a little bit. And in the 70s, when there was a lot of new religious movements and cults, and wherever they overlap, when people would sometimes, they would get kidnapped by their families or back out of these things. They're in some like Christian commune in 1971, and then like their parents, they're not talking to their parents anymore, and they'll go in and get someone to physically abduct them and bring them back. And then the person who would try to get them out of the cult frame was called a deprogrammer. Yeah. So the idea, it's the cult that's programming you.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the people in the counterculture or the alternative consciousness world, it was the mainstream world that was the source of the programming that had to be destroyed. So you have like this warring programming, who's actually programming who,
That's fascinating. Just a one more dip into high weirdness, and you brought up Lilly. Kind of one of the themes or meta themes of high weirdness that I noticed was this interrogation of the dance with madness. As Dennis McKenna goes through that in his adventures in the Amazon, and Robert Anton Wilson as well, and of course Phillip K. Dick. Was there any temptation for you to have Lilly be a fourth character for this book?
That's funny you asked that, because originally it was going to be a whole chapter on Lilly, and it's just that the thing was too long. It was already too long with just the three of them. And so Lilly is in there, but for like a few pages where I'm able to kind of give the greatest hits. And it is a disappointment that I didn't do that. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do it on my next book, but then I just got caught up in interesting things. And there's some work being done on Lilly. There's like more scholarly attention to him, but I still think that there's a lot that remains to be said. And he's an interesting one. Like I was interested in your presentation at the Alembic recently, which was really terrific. I hope you make it available to the people who listen to this podcast, because it was a great presentation. But I was interested to see that when you talked about Lilly, you were able to just say very straight, yeah, and he kind of went insane. Like what you see at the end of his life is kind of insanity. And some people wouldn't say that, and some people would. And it was interesting to me. I was like, oh, great, that's interesting. I could totally see that. I've wrestled with that myself. Am I going to use that term, which in some ways is pejorative, but in other ways is very accurate, to talk about people who are just really lose the plot, or you can't really communicate with them anymore. They're in some other world of signs and signifiers that don't make sense for the rest of us, in a way, that's one of the ways we define kind of madness. But it was important, Lilly is definitely part of that story. But I think the larger point is that, especially with psychedelics, if we're really getting in there and trying to really understand how these things operate and the richness and depth and dimensionality of the experience, we kind of do need to go back to the first phase of psychedelic thinking and say that there's actually something in the idea that these are psychotomimetics, which was a term used very early on, I think by Sandoz, and if not, by some of the early psychiatrists who were experimenting with LSD, where this was the first, like, what is LSD? How do we think about it? How do we categorize it? How do we name what it does? And so there was this term, psychotomimetic, meaning it simulates psychosis. So part of the idea was that therapists could take this stuff and then kind of get to know what it was like to be a schizophrenic.
Yeah. And
that's not true. That's not an adequate or accurate way of thinking about it. But there's been a kind of reverse polarized move in my mind especially over the last 10, 15 years of hype, but even earlier than that the people who were interested in psychedelics wanted to really emphasize how different they were from psychosis, how different they were from being kooky, even though there are moments inside trips that very much resemble not being rational anymore, being overwhelmed with the material from the unconscious, or babbling, or seeing too many synchronicities, and all these things that we also kind of associate with psychosis. And so part of the project with High Weirdness was, without going into the whole psychological question of what is psychosis, which is very problematic, it's a moving target. The models and languages are always changing, and that's all fine, but we can all agree, I think, with a few exceptions, that we kind of know when we're in a room with a mad person. We have a feel. In fact, some people prefer the term mad or madness. Even people who wrestle with madness, as opposed to these later terms that have a kind of science sound. Ooh, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. And just to say, okay, we don't know what any of those things really are, but we kind of know what madness is. And part of psychedelic experience, especially extreme psychedelic experience, can be a kind of passage through madness. We don't do ourselves a favor by ignoring that too much, particularly if we're plunging into this brave new world of the psychedelic renaissance. And so the way I wanted to frame the question with Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson, and with Phillip K. Dick as well, although in a different way, because he wasn't really a psychedelic guy. And he was kind of more of a visionary, kind of on the natch, like he was more fundamentally non-neurotypical than those other two guys.
Yeah. But I'm sure the amphetamines
didn't help. But he was like that from the time he was a kid. He was already having very bizarre cognitive experiences, and he was medicated early on. He was going to see shrinks when he was a teenager. And I mean, he was always sort of a bit, messed up in that sense, and trying to claw his way out and trying to think diagnose himself and to take tons of pharmaceuticals to try to modulate himself. And he was always sort of a kind of a psychopathological subject in that way that the other two guys weren't. And in a way, they kind of needed the drugs to play with the edge of pathology. And so what I really wanted to do was to suggest that there's a way of looking at psychedelic experience, not true for everyone, where part of what you're doing is kind of a dance with psychopathology, with sort of like a attraction to it and a resistance to it and an attempt to like work with it, to kind of integrate it, but and sometimes you get lost. Sometimes people get lost, and sometimes they don't come back. And if you're in these communities, especially in the past with the underground, everybody knows people who didn't come back. And the fact that can all happen to people, and it still can happen to, a certain percentage of psychedelically naive people who take psilocybin are going to have a really rough time. And some of them aren't going to come back. And that's just true. And they can gloss it up, and they can pretend that they've got the best method to deliver it. They can say, put it in a pretty pill, but that's never going to go away. There's always a dice roll in the picture. And so I just wanted to kind of put it on the table and say, part of what the problem of integration is, or part of like, what do we do with psychedelic experience in the rearview mirror? How do we make it meaningful in our lives and in our culture? We kind of have to address the issue of madness and what that is, what's productive about it, what's destructive about it, is there stuff, what's recoverable from it, can we avoid it? We have to wrestle with it in a more upright way than we have.
And I was surprised and interested and pleased actually that Agnew State Hospital project showed up in that book, High Weirdness. So just super quickly, and then I want to move on to Blotter, your new book. But the Agnew State Hospital project that happened here at Esalen was Dick Price was interested in this state of emergent, we could call it madness or psychotic breaks that people were having, and interested in viewing them in a way that didn't demonize that state at all, and in fact saw it as like a spiritual emergence. And that had quite an influence. The program, I don't think, lasted for a really long time at Agnew State Hospital, where they attempted to treat schizophrenia without intervention or drugs, but more sort of an observant attitude and supportive. But that continued at Esalen. I mean, the women at that talk were talking about the spiritual emergence network that was happening here during the 1980s, which I think Stan Grof had a role in.
Absolutely.
Supporting, yeah.
And then just to tie it up, that was, even though the some of the people being treated, if you want to think of it that way, at Agnew State weren't psychedelic people. By the time we get to the spiritual emergence network or emergency, that those were often people who had gone through devastating psychedelic experiences, who were like, what do I do? And their friends are like, this is more than I can handle. Part of psychedelic use, at least as I've come to understand it, and I think Terence's own life, both in the jungle and afterwards, would also support this, is you're kind of like dancing along that spectrum. You're kind of like seeing, what can we gain from the synchronistic mind of the of the kind of suddenly, connections are everywhere kind of mind. It's like one thing I always like to say is like, you get a couple of synchronicities, pretty awesome. It's like, wow, like there's some special thing in the world's not just meaningless. There's kind of a story and I'm involved in, and I've got a message sort of, but it feels like there's like another layer of meaning to life. And it's got this playful glimmering quality, a glimpse, a sort of, magical shiver. But if you have those things happening, hourly, no way, man, you're in the zone. You're on the far end of that pathological spectrum. And if you talk to people, they don't understand what you're saying, or they go, oh, this person's lost it, because you're seeing these synchronicities happening all the time. And that's sort of an indication that you've kind of left normal human reality. Whether or not you deserve to be called crazy or not, I'm not going to say, but it's part of the picture, and I think we're only now kind of realizing how challenging it is to deal with.
Erik, let's talk about Blotter. You describe Blotter acid as a meta medium in the book. So can you kind of go into that?
Yeah, I mean, this was such a fun project, to be able to work with my friend Mark McLeod, who has this huge archive of street blotter that he just started collecting in the early 80s, an ephemeral media, it's designed to be consumed. And somewhere along the way, people started putting pictures on it. And you're like, what is this? How do we even think about it? And most people don't even think about it as anything except acid. But he said, oh, no, this is kind of a folk art. Let's collect it. Let's keep an archive of it. And so to be able to go through that archive and build a book out of it and pull all these illustrations together and, these wonderful pieces from his collection, and to really think about it. And, the reason I call it kind of a meta media is that, it's partly a play on words, but one of the interesting things about LSD, and it is specific to LSD in a lot of ways. I mean, there are other drugs that people put on blotter paper, especially these days, but historically it's connected, only with LSD, partly for a reason, which because LSD is so small, you need so few micrograms to have an experience, that it becomes a little unmanageable in itself.
Yeah.
Like a little tiny pile of crystal LSD is more than you want to take. So how are you going to get that little pile into a format that is going to work?
How were the early Sandoz people, how were they distributing their
in
LSD?
Water and in pill form, but they would mix the pill form, so they were little grains inside a pill. Yeah. And so they took that into, and then I can't quite remember what the strength of the vials were. They weren't very strong.
Right.
But I mean, if you drank a whole one, you would be. But so they were already, basically using liquid, which is what most people would use. When they talk about sugar cubes, it's because somebody put acid into liquid, and then they take the liquid in an eyedropper and they drop it into to a sugar cube, which is basically the same idea with blotter. As you put the LSD in a solvent, and then it just dissolves and it distributes it, and then you soak the paper in that, or you drop initially they would drop little eyedroppers full of the liquid onto the paper, and then eventually they realize, hey, we can just soak the whole piece of paper and it will be distributed evenly throughout the paper.
Okay.
And then that's sort of a technological development or a technical development that allows them to produce it better. If you get your math right, because you have to kind of how much LSD is in the solution and what's the absorption rate of the paper. And if you get that all right, you can, put like a stack of many pages, many sheets in a plastic bag and pour in the right amount of liquid, and it will more or less evenly distribute throughout the material. So there's this whole kind of technical side that's really interesting. Yeah. But the reason it's a meta medium is that that's called in the language of the law a carrier medium.
Yeah.
So the sugar cube is a carrier medium for LSD, and it's significant because in certain times in the history of the prosecution of acid, the weight of the carrier medium would be included as part of the weight of the drug, which partly caused these really unfair and just kind of monstrously evil sentences for people who were carrying acid. So they were only, they had a gram of LSD. Okay, maybe you got to go to jail for that. I don't know. But they would not get prosecuted for a gram, but for, you know, a much higher weight. And so they do really, really long times. So the idea of a carry medium is really significant, but the thing is funny about Blotter, which you kind of don't think about unless you just look at it, is like you don't need pictures on the blotter paper for the blotter paper to do its job, which is to deliver LSD to you. So there's no reason to put pictures on it. It's only there for whatever, fun, branding, pride, humor, generosity, goofiness, you know, whatever. There's just all these sort of reasons to do it, and yet most people, you know, most blotter has the images on it, and so it's kind of meta because it's like, what are these things doing? Like, are they postage stamps? Are they badges of tribal identity? Are they magical sigils? Are they religious icons? Are they like the equivalent of like motorcycle patches? Are they like doodles? Are they comic books? Yeah. Like, there's no thing they are. You know, what are they doing as images? What are they communicating? How are they communicating? There's no answer because they're kind of anomalous.
Was there a crossover between the kind of underground art of the 1960s and what I think of as like the underground comics scene with R. Crumb and Zap Comics and Gilbert Shelton and the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, as well as the poster art of that time? Was that sort of contemporaneous with the Blotter? Yeah, it's
an interesting question. I say yes and no, and I talk about that in the book. That's actually one of the things I'm really kind of wrestling with. Is I'm like, well, whatever else Blotter is, it is a countercultural print medium, and it emerges from the same interest in, you know, or from the same world of countercultural print that we see in poster art, in underground comics, in the, you know, the sort of the culture of silk screening and of alternative newspapers. Yeah. So, you know, we think of the media of the counterculture, you know, we often think of like whatever, light shows or electric guitars or tape machines and sort of new electronic media. But in a lot of ways, print media is the most important. Again, newspapers, posters, broadsides, comics. That, I mean, there were so many alternative papers. It was like how you kept the world going. Like, how do you continue to live in your countercultural world? Maybe you're not in the hippest part of the country or the hippest part of the city. Well, you have these newspapers, and they like their images and their text allow you to be kind of inside this alternate world that's emerging. So print is really, really important. And printed Blotter doesn't really emerge until those other forms are on the decline. You know, so like poster art is really a late 60s fluorescence, and then it just kind of continues as a more commercial medium in the 70s. Same thing with underground comics that kind of follows poster art, at least in San Francisco. And you have this whole explosion. And then again, it continues on for decades, but it's kind of time of greatest creativity is sort of in this late 60s, early 70s. And Blotter doesn't really start to take off until the late 70s and doesn't really come into its own until the 80s.
Okay, so when they're talking about the brown acid at Woodstock in 69, they're talking about something that's on like a cube or a pill.
Exactly. There's very little Blotter distribution at that point. Just a tiny bit. But in that sense, it's kind of a little bit different. But in other ways, there are a lot of connections. I mean, even from the literal way that some people would use, you know, they would draw imagery from underground comics or posters and put it on Blotter. In fact, what the first printed image, you know, we'll never know what the first printed image on Blotter was, but there's a good argument to be made based on the record and the police records from the labs who are processing the material. There's a good argument to be made that it was actually Mr. Natural, which would be totally appropriate. It's like the best icon of that era, and also one that I think is really appropriate for the quality, you know, one of, to my mind, the most interesting qualities of LSD is the way that it's sacred and profane.
Yeah.
You know,
it's you write in the book about the way that kitsch images show up actually for many people during an LSD trip.
Yeah, that there's a kitschy dimension to it, and there's a humor to that, and that, you know, the sacred experience can turn in a moment and become kind of ridiculous.
That is Mr. Natural. Huh?
Yeah, and that's kind of Mr. Natural. So there's that kind of connection as well, and also just the general culture of heads who are just into print. You know, they're into making posters, they're into making bumper stickers, they're into making catalogs, alternative newspapers, and it's just like, oh, well, let's make Blotter. Okay, we'll do that. It's a different kind of print medium, but like, so there's kind of a continuity of culture there as well.
Yeah. Another thing that you write in the book too is that the folks who were creating and distributing LSD were not necessarily motivated only by the profit motive. There's somehow this desire to change culture that's almost evangelical that comes from these people. Yeah,
that's a really key element to emphasize about the LSD trade then and now, and it's in many ways has continued. I mean, to the degree I understand about that market, which is only so much. It has actually maintained a lot of these older traditions and even these older families that have been involved in the business for decades. It's not just a romantic thing. You know, I used to think, well, it's kind of just a romantic thing. Like there's something special about LSD and the people who make LSD. And yeah, sure, that's fine. But when I read this DEA report from the 1990s, like this isn't the 60s, it's not the early 70s, it's the 1990s. And I'm reading this DEA report, and they just have this paragraph that I quote in the book, and I'm just not going to do it verbatim, but it's basically like, LSD is not like other drugs. The people who are producing and selling it are not motivated by profit alone. Yeah. They also have they call it an ideological or crusading aspect, where they think it's going to change the world, or at the very least that it's a cognitive right to be able to have these experiences, and that they're doing something noble in the world. And the thing about that is, not only is that true in many ways, but it's partly because it's true that so few labs have been busted. Because if you have that value that's above the profit motive, it's almost like a religious value. Then when you get busted and you're going to do serious time, you're not going to rat, because it's going to destroy your very value system. I mean, there's a remarkable... I recommend anyone who's interested in this weird domain to watch this. It's on Soft White Underbelly, is a podcast, is a YouTube channel where the guy interviews like down and out characters.
Oh, I've seen that. Black and white?
Yeah, black and white.
God, it's disturbing.
And he gets really hardcore characters and, different kinds of people. I mean, they're not all from the street or whatever, but he has that kind of focus. And there's an interview with a guy named Joel who wrote a book. I should remember his last name, but I'm not going to do it. But it's like Joel LSD Dealer. And he's a deadhead in the 80s. He moves up the rank. He's very careful. And he talks about like finally meeting the kind of family, like the producers, and how cool they were, and how they would only let in dealers who were cool people, who weren't using heroin, who weren't alcoholics, who were kind, and like that they were really cool people. And then he gets busted, and it's like, his options are on the table. And, he's tempted. He's like, wants to save his skin. And he's like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And he goes through, and then he has a horrible experience in prison, like worse than normally. There's a whole backstory behind it, but he ends up going to a supermax prison, and, really, really, really rough ride. And at the end of the interview, the guy asks him, like, what do you, when you look back at your life, like, what would you have done different or whatever? And he was like, he has a few things to say, but he also says, I'm really, really glad I didn't tell. And, so it's, when I saw that, I was like, yeah, that's true. Like, people who get busted for LSD, in a way, they are like, they're like religious heretics. They're like punished by the religion of the mainstream world for their alternate religion. But they have like values that aren't just make money and have, enjoy, hedonistic values. And that then for many of them, the rubber hits the road when they have that decision to make, and it's really extraordinary.
Did you encounter any significant challenges in writing about a highly illegal substance, being illegal adjacent?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is less that I didn't so much encounter problems as I don't know the problems that I've encountered. I don't know how wrong some of it is, some of the story. Like I was just doing my best with the people I knew who seemed to have good stories, and I would try to double check them whenever I could. And I talked to a bunch of people, some of whom are named, some of whom demanded anonymity. And a few people said no, they didn't want to talk to me in any way. I think probably one of the coolest things in the book is I read a section that was specifically about a crew of blotter makers in San Francisco and their stories and those characters and who they were and what happened in that scene. And I read it to somebody who refused to talk to me, who was just, he had done time and was just not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But he did agree to have me read the section, and he was like, he just had a big smile on his face when he was done. So I got some stuff right, but there's a lot I'm sure that I totally didn't understand or I missed, or that were parallel stories that were happening somewhere else that I don't know anything about. So, it's there's already, a couple little tiny mistakes have already bubbled up. So it's hard to double check things. Yeah. And so, it was challenging in that way. On the other hand, I was really lucky in that I got to pull off of an archive of DEA, of a DEA journal called Microgram.
They had their own little zine.
Yeah, which was a zine, basically. Started in the late 60s, and it was between all the labs that study drugs. And so it's mostly kind of very technical information about how to, how do you measure the amount of coke and this and that and like different ways, and your mass spectrometry and all this kind of stuff. But the first page or page or two of the bulletin, because it was basically just like a mimeograph for a while, was descriptions of new drugs emerging on the street based on busts from around the country and occasionally from the world. And so it included a lot of information about Blotter. So I was actually able to have like another source of information that gave me a good picture of the overall market and even about the emergence of particular forms. So I was able to roughly date when different blotters hit the street and when they start to dominate and some of the, the logic around that. So there were a couple of different information sources that gave it some historical archival teeth. But you're an archivist. Archives are weird. Yeah. So it was really exciting to be able to go into like a very amorphous, marginal world that even people who are heads and underground people, they might like have fond feelings about Blotter, but they don't really think about it as like anything other than this drug delivery device. And you're sort of suddenly like, no, it's actually a real thing. And then you're like, oh yeah, God, you're right. So
yeah, you went deep into the margins this time. I don't know. Can you go deeper than that? A deeper cut than Blotter?
I don't think in my life I'm going to get that kind of opportunity again. I mean, nobody had written about it. There's just a few articles online. There's, if you go real deep into some dark web sites, you find some lore, and I have some of that lore. And that was one thing I should have used that term. That was one little regret, is that when I'm sort of explaining that there's a part early on where I say, look, there's inherent problems in writing about a criminal underground, and you're kind of relying on these weird sources of information, and I'm probably only, going to know so much. And like part of what I'm passing on is history, and part of what I'm passing on is lore, and I don't always know the difference. But in a lot of ways, if you go hunting for this kind of material inside a criminal underground, you're just going to get a lot of lore. And you're going to get a lot of lore no matter what kind of historical research you're doing. But in this case, it's more part of the picture. And it's even part of the picture because one of the ways that the acid industry protected itself was to surround itself with mirrors to kind of to create a lot of lore and misdirection, like the idea of like a magic trick where you're pointing over here to the left hand, so you do something else with the right. So there's tons of misdirection in the very sort of like process of doing the trade, and that's one of the reasons that like a lot of the LSD distribution networks used the Grateful Dead tour. So it wasn't just that you could go to the parking lot and buy a sheet and take it back to your, little small town and be the acid dealer for a week or a month or whatever. higher level dealers were meeting each other. Crystal was changing hands in large amounts. People were laying out sheets in hotel rooms. And it was because the whole scene, the whole crazy, wacky, druggy, messy scene was a good cloaking device for hardcore, upper level encounters and business. But even that business was kind of, carried out in the kind of flavor of psychedelic weirdness, like you wouldn't necessarily know the guy's name, but oh yeah, then and he's like, then you're in the hotel room and it's like, no, here's the, it had that kind of wacky acid quality. It was sort of to a degree because it was like a way of kind of disguising things.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So Erik Davis, you have released this book. You've gotten it out of your system. You come to Esalen several times a year and teach. You are running and co-running the Berkeley Alembic. Just tell me about what's animating you these days. What's your passion and what are you focusing on?
Yeah, well, I'm really interested. I mean, the Alembic's been going on for a couple of years.
For those of us who haven't heard about it, would you mind just
No, not at all. It's we still in a way I think that's good and sometimes challenging wrestle with how to describe it. Actually, for listeners of this podcast, it's easier because it's kind of like a little mini budding urban Esalen.
It is
because we like Esalen. We're attracted to the idea of pluralism.
Yes.
We think that the body is as important as the mind. We're interested in religious traditions, but we're also interested in very new ways of approaching the mystery and of playing. We have a strong interest in psychedelics, which has always been there in Esalen, sometimes more visible, sometimes less so, but it's always been an important part of the place, and a general enthusiasm for altered states and for creativity and for developing new forms of community. So these are all motivating factors. It's a little hard to describe for people who don't have that Esalen kind of context. We usually say it's sort of like a meditation center with an interest in visionary culture and body movement or something like that. Yeah. Institution building was never part of the picture for me. I've always been comfortable being a freelance writer and a mostly independent scholar. I mean, I do some academic teaching and some academic work just because I enjoy it. I like that culture in a lot of ways. That's very interesting. It's like, how do you kind of make a place like this work in 2024? Yeah. And what do you bring forward and what do you not? And, how to kind of organize that, how to program that. So I've really been enjoying it. I really enjoyed being able to have a place to bring in a lot of the wonderful, wacky, marginal, esoteric people that I've known and gotten to know in my interesting professional life, and to have a place to invite them, like inviting you, like, oh yeah, Sam, great. I didn't come up that day. There was a person who attended the Alembic who was like, you guys are kind of like Esalen. I mean, why don't you get Sam down here? I'm like, of course. Like, I just like, duh.
Jenny.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jenny came to my class here.
Yeah, and it was super cool. And it was like, so just being able to have a place where those kind of historical currents that both you and I take really seriously are able to have a place to exist next to things that might be a little bit more attractive to a contemporary audience, just meditation classes or tantra classes, vajrayana classes, stuff like that. And then like, hey, there's this thing about, here's a scholar who writes about, Thomas Merton in California, and like that kind of stuff that is so much animates our work. It has another place to express itself. So that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of what I've been kind of focusing on.
That's great. Okay. Well, everybody read Burning Shore, your Substack newsletter.
Yeah. That's fun. I put a lot into that too, and I'm hoping to be able to do a little more of that now once the crazy travel the last few months is over.
Awesome. And would you direct people who are interested in what you're talking about and the work that you've been speaking about to any pieces that you've created like along the way that feel like maybe essential Erik Davis?
You mean like articles or
Articles
work?
you've written, books you've written, or just,
Wow, that's so
Yeah,
crazy.
it's really far flung
Yeah,
what you've
yeah.
done. And one of the cool things about your site, TechGnosis, is that you've kind of got the entire thing out
Yeah.
there.
I mean, I've been keeping that site going, since the late 90s. And so most of my, except outside the books aren't there, but most of my writing, other than the books, is there. And I recently, with some help from friends, rebuilt the site to make it a more interconnected, a little more easy to navigate, and also a little more fun. Like we put in we call it the roll the bones, where you just go and you
Yeah.
you just randomly sample, because my work is kind of weird that way, in that I've been writing about marginal topics, most of which are now more visible
Yeah.
than they used to be, like esotericism and conspiracy theory and
Yep.
Bigfoot and all this kind of crazy stuff is now like more part of the mainstream. And so a lot of things that I wrote 20 years ago are actually still relevant, because I kind of wrote about them in a not I want to say a timeless way, but a way where they still resonate.
Yes.
So, just messing around on techgnosis.com is like a fun way in. And the book that I wrote, that I often say, if people haven't read my stuff, they want to start, is Nomad Codes, which collects a lot of my essays and like cultural journalism from the 90's. And it's, full of a lot of fun stuff like Goa, and Terence McKenna, and, a lot Burning Man, and a lot of the kind of subculture stuff that I did back then. And it's the most accessible one, because some of my other books are more academic. They have more scholarly stuff in them. And I'm probably going to do another collection maybe, within a couple of years.
It does also feel like TechGnosis is bubbling up, and it might be
That's
one to
true.
revisit in this time of.
I think thank you for saying that.
Technology.
I can't believe that it's over a quarter century, and it's always been in print, and people are reading it more now than they have been, and still gets new translations, and again, in ways that make me happy, and sometimes in some ways a little disappointed or kind of sad, because there's some freaked out stuff in my visions back then, and I'm like, oh wow, like that really did sort to come to be the case, and here we are, as all of these esoteric, mystical, apocalyptic currents that are ancient within our culture collide and commingle and get repurposed and it re-intensified by this crazy media environment that we're in. And it's just part of the picture in a way that you could, when I first wrote that book, a lot of people were like, what are you talking about? Like, that's just crazy stuff. Like, and even when it came out, it was like, people didn't really know what to do with it. Like, and nobody reviewed it. It was like, what the fuck is this? It was like anomalous because it didn't really make sense. But over the years, it makes more and more sense, because we can't keep that stuff separate from technology. And now that it's so pervasive, everything's sort of intertwingled in a way that's sort of exhilarating and fascinating, but also very claustrophobic and unnerving in a lot of ways. So yeah, I mean, TechGnosis, I think still really has legs these days.
Erik Davis, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. This was great.
Thanks so much for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme was composed by Nico Holloman. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. I'll be answering listener questions in some subsequent episodes, so if you have a question or a comment, please email me, sam.stern@esalen.org. Until next time, be well.